This is the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast, Episode 26, Maximizing Corn Yield Profits and Minimizing End Losses. I'm Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. Land-grant universities throughout the Corn Belt have been working for decades to adopt a nitrogen strategy that optimizes yield and maximizes profits. This has culminated with the online nitrogen rate calculator that can be used in several Midwest states. The data that drives the calculator is derived from the most recent nitrogen rate studies in each individual state. And by default, this calculation limits nitrogen applications to maximize profits for corn, not the yield. It also, by design, works to limit the nitrogen losses, says Illinois Extension agronomist Emerson Nafziger.
Well, one of the real quandaries is we know that the corn crop needs nitrogen, and we also know that nitrogen moves out of tile lines and into water. And so this is our goal is to give the crop just enough, and our hope is that it doesn't leak any of it out into the water. That hope is one that's almost impossible to realize. If you're going to grow corn, and you put enough nitrogen on to get its yields to where the corn has the capability to yield, then it's inevitable that some of that nitrogen in our climate, because we get more rainfall than the crop needs, and so some of the rainfall, some of the water is going to move through the soil and out through the tile lines, and that's why we have tile lines. So when water moves and there's nitrate in the soil, then some of that nitrate will move with the water into the tile lines. If there's a way to get that to zero, we're not quite sure what that would be, because it's a system that has some leakiness in it, and that's pretty much an inherent property. We'd like the soil to keep it all and then the crop to take it all up, but that's not really the way it works. Another issue we have in Illinois, it's not a bad one, it's one that makes us so productive, but that is that our soils have quite a bit of organic matter in them, and that organic matter has nitrogen as part of it. In fact, about 5% of the organic matter, the weight of organic matter, is nitrogen. And that's something that, not too many people think about, but the wonderful things that organic matter does for soil productivity. And with all the soil health talk and so on, organic matter is really the primary thing. If you have high organic matter, you have a healthy soil, is pretty much the way it appears. But that organic matter is a source of nitrogen. Now, the microbes break it down. The good thing is it isn't going on during the winter and so on, but it goes on anytime the soil temperatures get up above 50. This conversion of some of that organic nitrogen to a form that's available to the crop starts up. And the warmer the soil gets with good moisture, the more rapid that process is. So we have the soil organic matter producing some nitrogen that's available to the corn crop during the season. The big problem is that we're never quite sure at the beginning of the season how much that's going to be. And it's not a big trick for our higher organic matter prairie soils to provide, say, 150 pounds of nitrogen to the corn crop for the season. How do we measure that? Well, one good way to measure it is to do nitrogen trials and have a zero nitrogen. So in a zero fertilizer nitrogen, everything that the crop takes up came from that organic matter. And if we get in round numbers, if we get 150 bushel yields without nitrogen fertilizer, which in corn following soybean is not that unusual, that means that it took up 150 pounds of nitrogen from the organic matter. If we could have a way to know what that was going to be, and obviously in different soil types it's different, low organic matter soils produces less, and so there's more dependence on fertilizer nitrogen. And, soils with a light texture, the nitrogen can move away more easily. But the way we've approached this is just to do enough nitrogen trials so we can get a good idea, on average, how much fertilizer nitrogen we need to provide to the crop to give it the yields to not maximize yield. We really want to pull that back until the last nitrogen we put on is just paying for itself. And so we've done that and run the nitrogen rate calculator, and it says for central Illinois corn following soybean about 180 pounds of nitrogen at current prices is the amount that it takes to maximize profit per acre from nitrogen over hundreds of trials. So that's one approach to it. But that amount of nitrogen, if the crop is going to produce 220 bushel yields, it needs to take up about 220 pounds of nitrogen. And if the soil provides, say, half of that, 110, then the other half, 110, has to come from fertilizer. Well, 110 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer is simply not enough. But I think we need to get ourselves over the idea that, the more nitrogen we put on this crop, the more it's going to yield, because it simply doesn't work that way.
How exactly are the nitrogen rate applications for the state of Illinois developed?
Well, over the last 20 years, we've run a lot of nitrogen rate trials, and these are kind of accumulated into the nitrogen rate calculator, and you can go and find that online. It's pretty easy to find. Our database is a pretty good one in Illinois. We have for northern, central, and southern Illinois, and both for corn following soybean and for corn following corn. And if you go to that website, you will find those options. So you choose the crop for the area you're in, whether it was corn the previous year or soybean the previous year. And corn the previous year, as you might expect, generally requires more nitrogen than if it were soybeans the previous year. That's not the old 40-pound credit to soybeans we used to give. It's actually smaller than that, but there is a difference. So you do that, you put in current prices for what you want to use for corn and what nitrogen is costing you, and it will provide you sort of a best guess estimate of how much, based on all the trials that have been done, it will give you an estimate of how much nitrogen fertilizer should be used. We call that number the MRTN, which is maximum return to nitrogen, and that's just what we came up with to say this is the nitrogen rate that will maximize your economic return to the amount of nitrogen you use.
One last question. Are new technologies, things like crop sensing, site-specific application of nitrogen, helpful in meeting the NLRS goals?
Certainly, we have a lot of hope that some of this new technology, aerial photographs, satellite sensing, crop sensing of various sorts, will make nitrogen use more efficient. One of the problems is, though, that if you wait until the crop is showing some amount of deficiency, our research suggests that it may be a little too late to actually recover all of the yield. It seems that today's hybrids need nitrogen early in the season, and if they're deficient after they come up, that you may lose some yield that you can't get back by then putting more nitrogen on. So that's a fundamental issue that's still being investigated really actively. Certainly it's the case that lots of people were looking at all kinds of imaging and saying, well, we can go to the parts of the field that are pale or yellow and put more nitrogen there, and we can be more efficient in the nitrogen that we use. In practice, that's proven to be a lot more difficult than we thought it would be. I haven't given up on it. I don't think anyone has yet. But some of the early efforts at sensing, the on-the-go sensors, you'd put them on the nitrogen applicator, and where it was a little darker green, you'd put less nitrogen. Those aren't in real wide use anymore. And I think it's because in our soils, again, because of that supply of nitrogen that comes from the soil organic matter, sometimes we can get corn to waist high without nitrogen fertilizer at all. It's pretty dark green. And what's the crop, going to, it doesn't mean the crop doesn't need nitrogen. It just means that up to that point in time, the soil has supplied enough. That takes a warm and relatively dry season to get to that, but we certainly have seen some of that. And if that's the case, then waiting to sense, you might be waiting quite a while, and suddenly, that crop runs out of the soil supply nitrogen when the uptake demands are really high. Well, when the crop's waist high to head high, that's about the maximum uptake rate. And it may be really hard to respond in time. When we put fertilizer out there, we're not putting it into the plant. We're putting it into the soil and hoping that it can get to the plant. So there's some time aspects of that that's just going to make it difficult. And I think we'll get some modest improvements in that with new technology, but I think we're also going to have to accept at some point that we have to put the nitrogen on in time for it to do the crop the maximum amount of good. And rate is the thing that we probably need to pay the most attention to. When we get it on is a little bit more flexible, but certainly this crop needs some nitrogen early in order to make the kind of plant that it takes to produce the high yield.
Emerson Nafziger is an extension agronomist at the University of Illinois, joined us on this episode 26 of the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast. You can find the nitrogen rate calculator online. Just search for nitrogen rate calculator. Today's program was produced in conjunction with Illinois Extension Watershed Outreach Associates Jennifer Woodyard and Haley Haverback Gruber. As described in the State of Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, Woodyard works in phosphorus priority watersheds, and Haverback Gruber's work is with nitrogen priority watersheds. I'm Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason.